Thanks, Megs, also for inviting me. Thanks, everybody, for coming out. Okay, so subjects of the institution of art. It makes sense that institutions should be the subject of so much discussion today. We've been hearing a lot about changes in the nature of institutions. We're told that they no longer fit our still popular conceptions of them. They no longer have a kind of brick and mortar monumentality. They're no longer so static and monolithic. As far back as the 1970s, Jean-Francois Lyotard observed how, quote, disciplinary walls that once striated space are now collapsing, leaving in their wake clouds of narrative language elements and institutions in patches, end quote. Michel Desarteau has also described this new space as, quote, a dark sea from which successive institutions emerge. And more recently, Michael Hart and Antonio Negre, in their book Empire, talk about how, quote, as the walls of these institutions break down, the logics of subjectification that previously operated within their limited spaces now spread out, generalized across the social field, end quote. What on earth are these people talking about? Among examples which they and others point, fewer and fewer people actually live in traditional nuclear families, and yet the rhetoric of family values seems everywhere. Retail malls go bankrupt, but everything takes on the structure of a marketplace. Factories close and jobs are outsourced, and yet the work discipline seeps into every space, every activity, and every hour of the day. The canon of fine arts is in ruins, we've been told by people like Hal Foster, and yet everyday life becomes aestheticized, with connoisseurship and tasteful discrimination dominating the discourses of mass-marketed food, clothing, furniture, and more. This phenomenon is a defining trait of what's been called neoliberalism, post-Fordism, precarity, flexible accumulation, liquid modernity, creative destruction, disaster capitalism, risk society, and so on. On the one hand, you have this sort of dispersion of institutional space, but that itself turns out to be only one side of a coin whose flip side is the now pervasive mythology about neo-entrepreneurialism and voluntaristic do-it-yourself agency. Helping to bring about this shift in focus has been the rise to dominance of short-term contracts and other flexible business and labor practices. As Luke Boltanski and Eve Chiapolo write in their important 1999 book, The New Spirit of Capitalism, quote, in a world regarded as extremely uncertain and fluctuating, the self is the only element worth the effort of identifying and developing, since it is the only thing that presents itself as even minimally enduring, end quote. So given all these momentous changes, especially changes in the nature of social institutions, how do we in the art world talk about art as an institution? Recent discussions of, and especially in Europe, and less so in the States, recent discussions of experimental institutionalism and new institutionalism have attempted to update the terms that Daniel Buren used in the 1960s and that Benjamin Buchloh then repeated and amplified in the 1980s, terms that still stubbornly persist. That is, we used to say, or still often say today, that the art world is comprised of a series of white cubes. Studio, gallery, museum. This system, which has also been called the dealer critic system, supplanted the art academy at the end of the 19th century with a new set of institutional arrangements based on the lone artist, the private gallery, the private collector, and so on. It was said that the purpose of this new white cube apparatus was to organize and regulate the production of discrete objects and this discrete transfer of ownership of those objects. Furthermore, the support that this new white cube system provided to art objects was both ideological and practical. Along with imbuing art with the mystique of purity and timelessness, it also imposed a high level of technical conformity. As Daniel Buren himself put it, it provided, quote, a predictable cubic space, uniformly lit and neutralized to the extreme. And it was this white cube as a new standardized industrial norm that helped streamline an increasingly vast and disparate inventory of artworks as they pass from production to distribution to consumption. Now, when we go into a white cube gallery today, we find perhaps some discrete objects, but we might also find that it hosts artistic production itself that has taken on the function of the studio. Or it may function more like a movie theater with a film being screened. Or maybe a talk is being delivered like in a lecture hall. Or there might be a kitchen set up that serves food, or even an apartment. And I'm referring to just some examples like Andres Attel, Recreateur Venezia. This is Experimental Station in Chicago, turning a white cube into a classroom. This is Corin Hewitt at the Whitney Museum of American Art, turning the lobby gallery into his studio for a month. Exhibiting objects is thus only one of many potential purposes the gallery may serve. Thus, a more flexible institution. But even if we limit our discussion to traditional objects such as painting and sculpture, still the old white cube model is becoming less and less adequate. The old way of describing the ideological and practical functions of the gallery space is no longer adequate, for example, when accounting for the staggeringly over-moneyed activity at the art world's high end. The geographically and structurally far-flung operations of dealers like David Zwirner and Larry Gagosian, staging multi-million-dollar productions by artists like Richard Serra and Damien Hirst. But it's also not adequate when we talk about all of the cash-strapped, under-moneyed activity at the low end. All the freshly graduated do-it-yourselfers who exhibit in bars, hotel rooms, apartments, laundromats, whatever venues are at hand. In both scenarios, the objects on display are typically not for sale. Up high, everything is likely to be spoken for in advance, or it will only distantly betoken some more primary artistic project totally incompatible with the gallery exhibition format. While down low, there's simply no transacting whatsoever, save for an occasional trade or gift. Between these proliferating extremes at the high and the low, the formerly dominant middle, where you would still find individual buyers and sellers engaged in anonymous and isolated moments of market exchange, has been increasingly nibbled away. So, we end up with this question. Could it be that the dealer-critic system is now itself in the process of being superseded? And is it possible that we're seeing today a new system taking shape? And is this new system different because it regulates something other than objects? It's been argued, for example, that the circulation and management of information now takes priority, imposing its own system of requirements, a system that privileges telecommunicational screens over architectural walls, access over ownership, moments of attention over sustained contemplative judgment. But also gaining in prominence is the organization of artists themselves, as well as their audiences and discourses. That is, a system centered around the production, circulation, and maintenance of art subjects. Now, just to be clear, I'm not talking here about the lone individual. This is not the creative genius as social outcast, the romantic figure as it was developed in the 19th century as a centerpiece of the new critics-dealer system, right? The artist who hurls abuse upon collectors and the art marketplace in general, and so on. Rather, the subject of this new system, whether an artist or audience member, has been transformed in much the same way as has the discrete artwork that he or she would supposedly face off against. Another way of putting this is to say that the individual has followed down the same path that was blazed by the minimalist object. It's so funny to bend over like that. It's like I'm tapping a performing seal or something. Okay, so follow down the same path blazed by the minimalist object. We will remember how with minimalism, there were no more internal relations to the artwork. There was no composition, rather there were only external relations. How the object works with the things around it, so the art experience became about the room the object was placed in, and therefore about the institution that built that room, defines its function, and so on. Today, along with art objects, art subjects are also exteriorized. That is, the concern of our new system is less about inward-turned inspiration and contemplation than about outward-turned participation and responsiveness. The individual goes from being a person with a core and essence to being somebody who is performative, who is on demand and just in time, who is in constant feedback with her or his specific context from one moment to the next. Now, thinking about the institution of art as today prioritizing social labor and socializing, this relates to one of the main reasons behind the demise of the Academy Salon system, which was its inability to absorb the rising tide of people involved in art, in its making, in its selling, buying, publicizing, etc. And I think it could be argued that much the same is happening today. There is an overproduction of artists and audience that is far exceeding what the studio, gallery, museum apparatus was set up to handle. This is especially having a transformative effect at the non-commercial low end of the art world. That's kind of unfortunate to call it the low end, or just the under-moneyed end. Here, a new system, or a federation of systems, has been growing steadily. In the US, it now includes places like Greensboro, North Carolina, Minneapolis, Houston, Kansas City, Memphis, New Orleans, San Antonio, and to a large degree, these scenes look more and more like Brooklyn, and Brooklyn looks more and more like them. These are all places that don't fit in an art world identified solely with the studio, gallery, museum complex. There is no way that the art activity undertaken in, say, Kansas City, or here in St. Louis, or there in St. Louis, can be adequately addressed by just considering commercial sales and resale values and auction prices and the like. What we're dealing with here then, at least in the United States, is a much larger map and a far greater variety of situations. If not dramatically more diverse and inclusive, the art world is definitely becoming bigger and more evenly spread geographically. One big reason for this has to do simply with the number of graduate degrees in art awarded each year. In cities both large and small, this number has been growing steadily since the 1960s, and this despite all the recessions, the defunding of public arts agencies, the art market collapses, and so on. Graduate art programs and postgraduate residencies are important to this shift in focus from object to subject, because beyond graduating artists, what such schools and programs provide are many of the contexts in which the role of the artist can be performed and validated. Oh no, that was a huge yawn. The lack or total absence of commercial galleries means more weight will be placed on classrooms and visiting artist talks and shows at the campus gallery, as well as on the material support provided not only in the form of jobs as adjuncts or tech staff, but beyond the campus walls, it encourages the further support of potential venues and audiences in the form of the college town bar or coffee shop or music club. Especially in these scenes, though I think it's increasingly true of the art world generally, the graduate art program represents much more than an early and distinct segment in one's path to a life as an artist. It now reaches or stretches out to involve more and more types of activities over the entire course of one's art career. But more importantly, the graduate art program is one of the main institutions responsible for overseeing the reproduction of the art world's human capital. It's responsible, that is, for producing not art, but artists. This was the argument Howard Singerman made in his 1999 book, Art Subjects. Unlike on the undergraduate level, where priority is still given to instruction in the material techniques for making art objects, it's artists themselves who are the focus of graduate school. And this is one of the reasons why the emphasis in graduate education in art depends so crucially on critiques, both group critiques and individual studio visits about the visiting artist program and the artist talk and so on. so how else can I back up this claim that there's a new system and that it's best described as an institution of art subjects? When you take away the possibility of looking at art as an occasion for cash sales of discrete objects, there are a number of transitions that occur. One is that art making will often get valued in much the same way as does research in other professions, like say with academics, with art historians like me, who typically don't get paid to publish their work in academic journals. What we get instead from publishing is exposure, which in turn we use to leverage monetary support in the form of university jobs. Likewise, if you show at a community center or small artist space, or even a Kunsthalle or contemporary art museum, all these venues will typically claim to treat artists as professionals by rewarding their research more with exposure than with cash. Of course, the problem then arises that when it comes to artists, the job at the university, that using your exposure, you might snag, if you are lucky, that miracle of a job still is unlikely to pay the bills. University art departments are infamously the most underfunded units on campus, while they're also among the most bloated with adjunct hires that pay far less than a living wage. But this research model has become more and more pervasive in art. And I'm just showing you a drawing by William Pohida, the artist William Pohida, for the group WAGE, which is short for Working Artists and the Greater Economy. It's based, or it started in New York, but it's now franchising its model to other cities throughout the US. One of the things that they do is they're coming up with a wage accrediting system where if your institution is found by wage to meet its minimum requirements for compensating artists, participants, and so on and so forth in artworks, then you get accredited. And that in turn would shame, hopefully, institutions that fall below those requirements. Okay, so another outcome in the absence of cash sales has been that when art still does generate revenue, it will do so in a form that's usually about group support, that has the character of charity or donation rather than private acquisition. Especially with raffles and auctions and with other community support art mechanisms, the artworks on a certain level need to function as an alibi for events that reproduce and replenish the scene. And the more this is the case, the more the artworks themselves will seem to reflect community by being roughly undifferentiated in value, as if any work by any artist could potentially fill this task. Raffles and CSAs tend to drive prices toward a narrow average, and this suppression of price differentiation can start to recall an almost medieval condition when the craft guilds would establish price-fixing monopolies. But most importantly, in all these flyover scenes, it won't be commercial sales or government support or that rare grant from some Medici-like private patron in the United States. Increasingly, that would be the Warhol Foundation. These things won't matter. It's much more likely that artists will survive by turning toward each other, by cobbling together crowdsourced support and ad-libbing galleries and other occasions to meet and stay informed, all to achieve the level of coherence necessary for internally reproducing things like professional status and recognition, that is, for running art worlds. Under such conditions, art will have to take a back seat to the social labor needed to create its various conditions of existence and visibility. And this holds true for painters and sculptors as much as anyone else. If they want to exhibit, then they too must devote as much, if not more, attention to organizing as to object making. Now, when I say a new system, I do mean, to a certain extent, a new system is coming into place. In the US, at least, artists and independent arts organizers from around the country now convene at annual or semi-annual conferences. This would include Creative Time in New York, but more importantly, a thing now called, what?
Hand in Glove.
Thank you very much, Hand in Glove, which had its first iteration in Chicago. The second one was in New Orleans, and the third one coming up this summer will be in Minneapolis. These artists and artist organizers, or arts organizers, also publish national directories, such as Phone Book, which comes out of Chicago, put together by the organization there called Three Walls. And out of necessity in today's arts funding climate, they've developed new crowdsourced funding mechanisms and models like community-supported art and art subscription services that, if they work, are then passed around for others to emulate. Finally, just in the last couple of years, with support from the Warhol Foundation, among other private patrons, these incredibly small to not so small arts organizations and arts organizers have acted on their sense of common cause by forming a new national organization called Common Field. And this organization has come about or come into being for the purpose of helping to sustain and advocate for any and all such grassroots alternative artist initiatives and projects through the US. And I'm showing you one of the pages from their new website, which can be found at commonfield, all one word, .org. And this is another page from their website, which features the initial people who got together to think through the creation of this thing. And what's interesting about it is there are only two names that are listed from New York. One is not even an actual functioning space. It's like me, it's Martha Wilson who's involved to just kind of speak from artist spaces past. About what it was like to have an NEA that funded contemporary art. But it gives you a sense of, or at least in the US, it's kind of remarkable to see this list in terms of its geographic spread, and it's not being centered in New York. Okay, to wrap up, does this dematerializing of commodities and suppression of markets and subsequent privileging of social labor, does this at least now mean that artists in such scenes can enjoy a less alienated relationship to their activities? Can we now speak of autonomous art subjects rather than art objects? One caveat I'd want to make is that artistic labor under such conditions is likely to become more intensely fragmented and thus more prone to instrumentalization. In step with our on-demand, just-in-time world, artists, like workers in other spheres, are expected to assume a host of varied tasks and to switch between them from moment to moment, context to context. Whereas it used to be much more commonly assumed that a painter was someone who made paintings, like a pipe fitter fits pipes, instead today, often approaches and solutions will need to be improvised well beyond the expectations of training and expertise. For artists, this again holds true whether their practice is studio or post-studio. I know this as a teacher who sometimes reviews graduate program applications, sometimes hires young adjuncts, sometimes juries art awards. Painters and sculptors know that shows are no longer enough, that their CVs will look thin if they don't also list residencies attended, blogs published, shows curated, performances staged, and so on. The more diverse the categories, the better. And this in turn means that the studio will have to now accommodate more and more on-demand identities and functions well beyond just making art and performing the role of the artist. This has its corollary on the superstar end, where there the artist must be a manager, supervising an army of workers undertaking a wide array of tasks. But it's also true for the low end, although with this big difference. Here the artist must self-manage, must juggle an array of obligations her or himself. The result is a kind of constant management crisis for the studio and the labor undertaken there. The studio remains a place of artistic labor. It's where one undertakes the daily practice of painting, to borrow Gerhard Richter's now famous line, or it's that place that Bruce Nauman described back in the 1960s. It's where art becomes whatever an artist does while filling time just sitting around the studio. But today, the main problem for the artist seems to be just how to scrounge up the spare time to actually make art and perform the role of the artist, despite having to attend to the million of other things that need to get done. Finally, we should also remember that art as an institution of subjects still faces the same problem that it did as an institution of objects. That is, art subjects are still identified as separate, as belonging to a particular profession, a specialized proprietary field of knowledge and labor. And this again has a lot to do with all those graduate art programs and postgraduate residencies. After all, it's this separateness that graduate school teaches and reproduces. How to get students to create what's recognizable, what counts as art. How to get them to situate their work as arising from and expanding upon an art discourse, accumulating around it a set of related historical and contemporary practices, all backed up with a bibliography. Now, all this will sound no doubt downbeat, since of course professional solidarity seems to fall short of other types of social or political solidarity. We tend to think, after all, that the very definition of a radical art is based on its ability to transcend its own professional and institutional limitations. And indeed, many of the artists in these more remote scenes do just that, such as Brett. They engage and impact public policy debates on education, climate, healthcare, gentrification, censorship, and so on. But they still operate as artists, which is to say, even when a certain action of theirs does reach out and affect social and political spaces, artists still operate from a privileged position, and it's that position that remains separate and will be the source of alienation and suspicions and resentments, etc. And this was a big point of argument in the creation of Common Field, was using the word field. Field, it was pointed out, suggests professionalization. It's a field that one, gains their degree in, publishes their research for, gets status and recognition within, so on and so forth, right? If you work in an academy, you know that if you want to get your contract renewed, it's all about, how you participate in your field, how you recognize within your field. Okay, finally, what can we make then of this type of solidarity, this act of organizing that's at once empowering and institutionalizing? Or perhaps a less divisive way to approach the question is this: is it possible that the name artist can entail political obligations from those who embrace it? And can the category of artist itself be made to conjure its own utopian social vision? Another one of the outcomes of shifting focus from art objects to art subjects is that the issue of labor comes more immediately to the fore. To characterize activities undertaken by artists as labor in turn foregrounds the historical dimension of the idea of art's autonomy. That is, it's been argued that autonomous art becomes possible only when labor itself reaches a surplus, when enough free time is made available so that activity otherwise devoted to survival, what one has to do for food, warmth, and shelter, can instead be spent on manifesting creativity as an end in itself. This holds true individually when, say, you don't have to worry about money because you have a trust fund or something like that. But also, it holds true collectively when labor in general becomes socialized and automated and made efficient enough to decrease work hours across the board. And indeed, our society produces a good deal of surplus. That is, excess wealth and thus freedom from labor as necessary toil. Only the surplus is misrecognized as individually rather than socially produced, and is in turn hoarded by an infinitesimally small fraction of the population. This historical project of not just expanding, but more equally distributing freedom can thus articulate one of the many relationships between labor as a means to an end and art as a form of laboring for its own sake. And hence, it can also bridge the professional existence of artists to that profession's larger social relevance. In other words, such a notion of art holds out a promise, albeit one that's continuously frustrated. As more and more artists struggle under the weight of huge student loan debt, are barely able to survive, their creativity narrowed by necessity, their art as surplus folded back into scarcity. Struggles to better fulfill this promise that art holds out of freedom, in turn suggest a politics. And it's a politics that all artists, not despite, but in their professionalization and in their institutionalization, could possibly engage, respond to, and enact. Thanks.